Hey guys, tonight we begin with the sun-baked, olive oil-slicked world of ancient Greece, a civilization known for philosophy, democracy, and statues that didn't believe in pants. But beneath the legends of Plato, Sparta, and golden temples lies a much harder truth. Because while ancient Greece gave us the roots of Western civilization, it also gave its average citizen a daily struggle you'd barely survive today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to ancient Greece, where your day begins not with an alarm clock, but with the sun turning your house into a slow-cooking oven. Your home is a modest one, made of sun-dried mud bricks or rough stone, with small windows and no glass, just wooden shutters to keep out the goats and maybe some breeze if the gods are feeling generous. There's no insulation, no ceiling fan, and certainly no such thing as personal space, unless you count the corner where the family goat doesn't sleep. You rise early, not because you're disciplined, but because it's already too hot to stay horizontal. In the summer, the stone walls absorb heat like a sponge, and by sunrise, your little house is radiating it back into your bones. In winter, those same walls turn into a freezer, and you're basically wrapped in a sheet, hoping not to become a statue of frostbite. You probably slept on a thin mat or a straw-stuffed mattress, with no pillows, just a rolled-up cloak or maybe your arm. If you're lucky, the lice left you alone last night, but probably not. There's no running water, so your morning routine involves either walking to the public fountain or, if you're rural, hauling water from a nearby well. You carry it in clay jars balanced on your shoulders while silently praying you don't trip and shatter a week's worth of back pain on the ground. To get clean, you don't bathe in the morning. That's saved for the end of the day, if at all. You might splash your face, rub some olive oil on your skin, then scrape it off with a straggle, a curved metal blade. Think of it as a spa day, but without the spa, the day, or any real effect. And don't even think about privacy. Your family lives in the same room, so you sleep together, eat together, and argue over who tracked mud in from the street, because the street is also your hallway, your news feed, and your trash dump. You haven't even eaten yet, and already your back hurts, you're sweating, and your tunic is sticking in places no tunic should. And this is the best part of your day. So you've survived the sweatbox of a Greek bedroom. Time to fuel up, right? Welcome to breakfast in ancient Greece, a meal so minimal it makes modern intermittent fasting look like gluttony. Your first bite of the day is barley bread, stale, dense, and about as exciting as the dirt it was baked near. It's called maza, made from ground barley mixed with water, shaped into flat cakes, and left to bake either on hot stones or in the ashes of last night's fire. Think ancient granola bar, but without sweetness, texture, or joy. You might dunk it in watered-down wine because, surprise, the water isn't always safe to drink. There's no filtration system, no boiling, no Brita pitcher in your clay pantry. So instead, everyone from kids to elders gets a cup of oinos mixed with water, not for the buzz, but for survival. If you're wealthy, maybe you get a fig or two, some olives, or a smudge of goat cheese. But let's be honest, you're not wealthy. You're lucky if your bread isn't crawling with yesterday's flies and doesn't crack a tooth when you bite it. No coffee, no eggs, no fruit bowl, no honey, unless you live near a decent beekeeper and know how to bribe them. And don't expect to sit and relax. Meals are fast, with no chairs, no forks, and certainly no mindful eating. You chew, you nod, and you get back to work. Oh, and if you're a woman, you don't even eat with the men. In many households, women and children eat separately, often after the males are done, so not only is the food bad, you also get to wait your turn to be disappointed. The irony is that Ancient Greeks are the same people who gave us symposiums, banquets, and poetic odes to wine. But breakfast isn't worth a line of verse. It's utilitarian, dry, often literally burnt, and yet you chew through it like a champion, because it's the only thing standing between you and a full day of sun, labor, and arguing philosophers. Bon appétit! Just try not to crack a molar. Now that you've choked down your stale barley brick in a splash of wine water, it's time to freshen up, or more accurately fail to. Because in ancient Greece, hygiene wasn't so much about cleanliness as it was about ritual and oil, and soap is a fantasy reserved for future centuries. Your morning bath usually involves pouring cold water over your body at the public fountain or courtyard basin, unless you're lucky enough to live near a bathhouse, which most people don't. There's no shampoo, no minty body wash, and no sponge unless you stole one from a sponge diver in the Aegean. Instead, you turn to olive oil. Yes, oil. You rub it into your skin not to moisturize, but to collect the dirt and sweat. Then you scrape it off using a straggle, a curved bronze blade that leaves you less greasy, but still a little questionable. Imagine slathering yourself in salad dressing and then shaving it off. That's your skincare routine. And if you think that sounds glamorous, just remember everyone else is doing it too, often in communal settings, naked loudly. Hygiene is social in ancient Greece. Privacy is not. Now, let's talk teeth. There are no toothbrushes, no toothpaste. Maybe you rub your gums with crushed charcoal or rinse with vinegar if you're fancy, but mostly you chew on a twig and hope for the best. Dental hygiene is more about divine mercy than routine care. Body odor is ubiquitous. Deodorant doesn't exist, but perfumes do for those who can afford them, so you might dab a little myrrh or rose oil on your neck right before walking 5 miles in sandals through the Athenian heat. The result is a uniquely Greek blend of musk, dust, and desperation. Laundry is rare. Clothes are washed by beating them against stones in the river. If you're poor, your tunic probably hasn't seen water since last festival season. In short, hygiene in ancient Greece isn't about looking or smelling good. It's about appearing moderately less revolting than yesterday. The oil and scrape method helps, but only so much when you're sweating in a tunic under a sun that's trying to kill you. So, yes, ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and architecture, but a decent shower is still waiting. Now that you've oil scraped your way into a new day, it's time to get dressed, and spoiler alert, your ancient Greek wardrobe is minimal at best and comically impractical at worst. You've got 2 options, a chiton or a himation, both basically oversized linen rectangles that you wrap and pin with a brooch or tie with a belt. It's not tailored, it's not fitted, and it absolutely wasn't designed with windy days in mind. One wrong breeze and suddenly your whole philosophical outlook is on display. Forget underwear. It's not a thing, and bras don't exist. So unless you're a Spartan woman trained to sprint and wrestle, you're just hoping your pins hold, and no one notices your wardrobe shifting like a loose curtain. Now let's talk footwear. If you're lucky, you own a pair of leather sandals. If not, you're barefoot, and that means a full day of walking on sun-baked stone, goat-trodden dirt, and whatever the local market has squished into the roads. Imagine strolling across a skillet in July while dodging donkey dung. That's your daily commute. Of course, there's no sun protection, no hats, unless you're a farmer or a sailor, and no sunscreen because you live in 450 BCE and science hasn't been invented yet. The Aegean sun doesn't care how philosophical you are. It will roast you. By noon, your shoulders are burned, your feet are filthy, and your linen robe has stuck to you in 4 places that defied geometry. And don't forget, public nudity isn't shocking in Greek society. You might pass men at the gymnasium training in the buff, or even politicians delivering speeches in togas that barely hold together. Now, if you're wealthy, your tunic might be dyed, maybe a soft purple or saffron yellow, but most people wear off-white or brown because dyes are expensive, and no one wants to waste good color on the guy who fixes fishnets for a living. So, you walk through your day dressed like a toga burrito, sunburned, sweating and hoping your pin doesn't pop loose in front of the priestess. And the worst part? You're only halfway through your chores. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service isn't a job. It's your civic duty, your social expectation, and sometimes your one-way ticket to an early grave. If you're a free male citizen, especially in Athens or Sparta, congratulations, you're automatically a soldier, whether you like it or not. By your teens, you're already training with wooden weapons and learning formations in the phalanx, that famous Greek battle strategy that involves standing shoulder to shoulder behind large shields and hoping the guy next to you doesn't trip. In Sparta, boys start military training at age 7 in the brutal agoge system, a program that turns children into warriors by essentially starving, whipping, and isolating them until only the toughest remain. In Athens, things are gentler, but still mandatory. 2 years of training in your late teens, followed by decades of being on call. You don't get to say, I'm more of a thinker. Even philosophers like Socrates fought in wars, and not with witty comebacks, but with actual weapons. And there's always a war, whether it's Sparta versus Athens, Athens versus Persia, Sparta versus literally everyone, or just a neighboring polis getting sassy about trade routes. Conflict is a way of life. Peace is just the pause between two invasions. For armor, if you can afford it, you get a bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, a round hoplon shield, and a spear. If you can't, well, try not to be in the front row because leather and cloth don't stop arrows. The worst part is you supply your own gear. That's right, being a soldier is a biob situation. Bring your own bronze. Poorer citizens either beg, borrow, or fight lightly armed, which is Greek for more likely to die first. And when you're not fighting, you're preparing, training, cleaning weapons, arguing in the assembly about strategy, or rowing warships for hours as part of the Navy. Because yes, those triremes don't paddle themselves. There's no veterans' health care, no pensions, no therapy, just scars, limps, and the occasional poorly carved gravestone praising your virtue and courage. If you think life as a man in ancient Greece sounds rough, just wait until you hear about being a woman. In most Greek city-states, especially Athens, women had fewer rights than a pile of decorative urns. You couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't own land outright, and rarely appeared in public without a male escort. In fact, if people saw you out too often, they might start whispering that you were a courtesan. Or worse, a Spartan. Let's start with your daily routine. You wake up before sunrise to start the chores, spinning wool, weaving cloth, grinding grain, fetching water, baking bread, managing the slaves if your household has any, and raising the children. You are the household CEO, but one without pay, respect, or days off. Your social life is limited. You don't attend plays, you don't join the philosophical debates, and you're not at the gymnasium because that's for naked men only. You're confined mostly to the gymnasium, the women's quarters, and your contact with the outside world consists of glimpses through latticework windows. For education, if you're lucky, you might learn to read a bit, but mostly you're trained in domestic duties. Philosophy, rhetoric, geometry, that's for the boys. Your job is to marry well, have sons, and stay invisible while doing it. Marriage happens young, often in your early teens, to a man twice your age, arranged by your father, who treats you more like a trade agreement than a person. Love is optional, dowries are mandatory, and when you do have children, your primary value becomes your womb. Now, Sparta was the exception. Spartan women were famously more liberated. They were educated, exercised in public, and could own property. But before you envy them too much, remember their freedom came from a state-sponsored obsession with warfare and eugenics. Your main job as a Spartan woman was to give birth to strong warriors or face disgrace. And if your husband dies, you can't inherit much. You can't remarry without permission. And your options shrink faster than your social circle. You're stuck legally, socially, and often physically. So yes, the Greeks worshipped powerful goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Hera, but real women were expected to stay quiet, stay home, and stay out of sight. Ancient Athens is hailed as the birthplace of democracy. And yes, technically that's true, but before you get too excited, let's be clear, you probably wouldn't qualify to participate. In fact, the majority of people living in Athens were completely excluded from the democratic process. To vote in the Athenian Ecclesia Assembly, you had to be a male born to Athenian parents, a citizen over 18. That means women, foreigners called metics, slaves, and children, who made up nearly 90% of the population, had no political voice whatsoever. That's not democracy for the people. That's democracy for a very specific club of sunburned men in sandals. If you met the criteria, though, you didn't just vote. You were expected to participate constantly. Laws were proposed, debated, and passed in huge assemblies of thousands of citizens. There were no career politicians. Every eligible man was part legislator, part jury member, and part overconfident amateur. You could even be randomly chosen to serve in powerful positions like running the treasury or serving on a jury through a lottery system, which sounds thrilling until you remember there were no qualifications. Your fishmonger might oversee military logistics one day, and your uncle, who still believes in sea monsters, might judge a murder trial tomorrow. And if someone got too powerful, too popular, or just annoyed people the wrong way, ostracism. Once a year, citizens could write a name on a broken piece of pottery, an ostracon, and vote to exile that person for 10 years. No trial, no defense, just go away, you're getting too famous. And yet, despite its flaws, Athenian democracy was revolutionary. It gave ordinary men a voice, well, some ordinary men, and laid the groundwork for future political systems. But make no mistake, it wasn't fair and it wasn't inclusive. If you were a woman, silenced. A foreign-born resident who paid taxes, silenced. A slave building the Parthenon, definitely silenced. A philosopher who asked too many questions, possibly executed. Democracy was born in ancient Greece, but if you'd shown up expecting equal rights and inclusive politics, you'd have been escorted out of the assembly and told to bring your own ostracon. In ancient Greece, slavery wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Even modest households had at least one slave, not because the family was wealthy, but because slavery was so deeply woven into society that it felt as normal as sandals and sunburn. The idea that someone might not own another human being was practically unthinkable. Slaves weren't a specific race or ethnicity. They came from conquered lands like Thracians, Scythians, Syrians, and even fellow Greeks from the wrong city-state at the wrong time. Some were born into slavery, others were prisoners of war, and a few were kidnapped and sold. It was a thriving, brutal market, and business was always good. If you lived in Athens, your slave likely did everything: cooked your meals, fetched your water, cleaned your home, cared for your children, carried your shopping, and stood silently during dinner. Some even handled business affairs or managed the household while the citizen owner lounged at the symposium, sipping diluted wine and debating abstract concepts like justice. Irony level maximum. In the silver mines of Laurion, slaves, including children, labored in horrifying conditions, crawling through narrow shafts in total darkness, inhaling toxic dust, and dying slowly for the sake of coins and civic pride. Some slaves were educated, teaching grammar and math, serving as scribes, or even managing bank accounts, but make no mistake, they were still property. They could be beaten, branded, sold, or killed on a whim and had no legal rights. The few who earned freedom, called freedmen, were never truly free. They still owed loyalty to their former masters and were barred from citizenship, with no voting, no land ownership, just the hope of a slightly better tomorrow. And unlike later slave systems, there was no widespread abolitionist movement. Philosophers like Aristotle, yes, that Aristotle, justified slavery as natural and necessary. According to him, some people were slaves by nature. Enlightening, isn't it? Ancient Greece gave us ethics, democracy, and philosophy, but all of it was built on the backs of people who were never allowed to speak, never allowed to vote, and never allowed to matter. And that's not a footnote. It's the foundation. Feeling unwell in ancient Greece? That's unfortunate because unless you live next door to Hippocrates himself, your healthcare plan includes some vague herbs, divine intervention, and a lot of wishful thinking. Let's start with the basics. There are no hospitals as we know them. If you're sick or injured, you stay home. Maybe a neighbor knows a thing or two about poultices. Maybe a relative remembers a prayer to Asclepius, the god of healing. Or maybe your local temple has a snake you can pet for spiritual comfort. That's about it. The most famous Greek doctors were really a mix of herbalist, philosopher, and gambler. They believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to them, illness was caused by an imbalance in these fluids, so if you had a fever, too much blood, time to drain it. Coughing, too much phlegm, try fasting. Melancholy, that's black bile. Maybe take a walk or stare at the sea dramatically. Most treatments were based on trial, error, and garlic. You might be given crushed poppy seeds. Good luck with that. Boiled figs, or a compress made of vinegar and something someone scraped off a goat. Did it work sometimes? Did it hurt? Almost always. Surgery was rare, terrifying, and generally a last resort. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, even a simple cut could go septic and kill you. Tools included iron knives, bone saws, and prayers, lots of prayers. And if you needed something amputated, hope you brought a leather strap to bite down on. Midwives handled childbirth, which was dangerous even on the best days. Mortality rates for women and infants were tragically high. One bad birth, one stuck shoulder, one breech baby, and that was it. If you were wealthy, you might summon a traveling physician, someone with an actual scroll and some fancy oils. If you were poor, you relied on local knowledge, street remedies, and sheer resilience, or you simply didn't recover. But hey, at least they believed in rest, clean air, and a balanced diet. So there's that. Ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath, but it also gave us treatments like drink boiled cabbage water. So yes, healthcare in ancient Greece was mostly herbs, hope, and hang on. In ancient Greece, theater wasn't just entertainment. It was a civic duty, a religious ritual, and sometimes a full-contact sport for the soul. Let's start with the good part. Theater was free for citizens, assuming you weren't a woman, slave, or foreigner, in which case good luck seeing anything. You'd file into an enormous open-air theater carved into a hillside, like the Great Theater of Dionysus in Athens, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other sweaty citizens, and you'd be there all day. Seriously, all day. The Dionysia festival ran from dawn until night with back-to-back plays, tragedies, comedies, and satyr plays. No intermission, no snacks, and certainly no bathroom breaks unless you counted a bush on the hillside. If you showed up late or acted out, you weren't just frowned at, you could be fined. The performances themselves were wild. Tragedies were emotionally gutting. Murder, madness, war, gods destroying families because of one bad decision made 3 generations ago. You didn't come to laugh, you came to weep in unison. Then came the comedies, which weren't exactly light-hearted family fare. These plays mocked politicians, philosophers, entire cities, and bodily functions with stunning precision. Imagine if Saturday Night Live and a college debate had a baby, then dressed it in a giant phallic costume and sent it on stage. Actors wore towering masks, platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes, all male, of course, even for women's roles. The chorus sang, danced, and shouted commentary like an ancient Greek version of Twitter, only louder and wearing tunic. And this wasn't passive viewing. The audience was loud. They booed, hissed, threw things, and argued mid-performance. Theater was democracy with stage lights. If the play offended you, you let them know. If it moved you, you shouted, wept, and maybe reevaluated your life. At the end of the festival, a jury voted on which playwright won Dindy. Imagine spending 3 days crying over Orestes, only to find out some bawdy comedy with a talking pig god took the prize. That's ancient Greece for you. So yes, in the theater you were never just watching, you were participating and possibly throwing olives. So you've survived your tragic all-day theater binge. Now you wander into the agora, the bustling heart of the city, and stumble right into a man wearing a cloak, holding no shoes, and asking, "What is justice?" Welcome to philosophy. It's everywhere. And it's not optional. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, philosophy was the local sport, and the champions were names we now associate with world-changing ideas. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Back then, though, they were just eccentric men who talked a lot and made other people feel stupid. Take Socrates. The man made a career out of asking questions that led nowhere and dismantling people's confidence in their own opinions. You might be minding your own business, buying olives or petting a stray goat, and he'd appear. Do you believe in truth? I guess. What is truth? Cue 3 hours of mental spiral and a desire to move to Sparta. He never wrote anything down. His student Plato did that, but Socrates left a lasting impression, partly because Athens eventually executed him for being too annoying. Officially, it was corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. But let's be honest, he probably just wouldn't stop asking questions during dinner. Philosophy wasn't a cozy academic hobby. It was loud, confrontational, and weirdly athletic. Debates happened in public spaces. They were spontaneous, intense, and often ended in hurt feelings or deep existential crises. No microphones, just voices, hands, and enough ego to fill the Parthenon. And if you thought you could just watch, think again. Philosophers loved drawing in random bystanders. You didn't walk past Plato's Academy. You were absorbed into it. You said one thing slightly wrong, and suddenly became the day's example of an unexamined life. Even kids weren't safe. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great, a teenager who later conquered half the known world. Imagine your high school civics teacher handing you a globe and saying, "Go fix this." So yes, philosophy gave us logic, ethics, science, and political theory. But in ancient Greece, it also gave you a headache, a crisis of identity, and a 70% chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in sandals. So, you've made it in ancient Athens. You're well-spoken, clever, politically active, and people like you may be too much. That's your first mistake, because in Athens, being too popular could get you kicked out of the city for 10 years, not arrested, not fined, just gone. This wasn't a conspiracy or a backroom deal. It was built into the system. It was called ostracism, and it was perfectly legal, perfectly public, and perfectly terrifying. Once a year, the citizens of Athens would gather to decide whether to hold an ostracism vote. If enough people agreed, everyone wrote the name of a person they wanted exiled on a broken piece of pottery called an ostracon. If someone got 6,000 or more votes, they were banished with no trial, no explanation, Just pack your sandals and leave. You didn't have to be a criminal. In fact, most ostracized people had done nothing wrong except get too influential. Maybe you were a war hero, a persuasive speaker, or just had great hair. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a threat to democracy, and democracy voted to yeet you into temporary oblivion. And here's the twist. It wasn't permanent. Ostracism lasted 10 years, after which you could come back like nothing happened. Your property was untouched. Your citizenship remained. No grudges, just a decade-long vacation you didn't ask for. Some famous Athenians were ostracized. Aristides the Just was so well-liked that someone allegedly voted against him just because they were sick of hearing how virtuous he was. Brutal, docile. Even Themistocles, the military genius who saved Athens at the Battle of Salamis, got the boot once he got too cocky. Turns out gratitude has an expiration date. Ostracism was meant to protect Athens from tyrants, but it often punished success. So if you were ambitious, you had to walk a fine line, be respected but not too respected. Popular but not charismatic enough to worry people. Think of it like a reality show where the prize for winning too many fans is being exiled to the countryside with your dignity and olive oil stash. Athens gave birth to democracy, but it also invented cancel culture 2,500 years ahead of schedule. In ancient Greece, you didn't ask if you were going to die young. You just wondered how soon and how painfully. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years. And that was if you made it past infancy, which was no small feat. Roughly 1 in 3 children didn't survive childhood thanks to disease, poor nutrition, and the fact that hygiene was, as we've discussed, more theoretical than actual. You could die from anything. A scratch that turned septic, a fever no one could explain, childbirth, a leading cause of death for women, or something as simple as drinking the wrong cup of water. Medicine was limited, and divine intervention wasn't known for consistency. If you lived in a city, disease spread fast. Cramped quarters, open-air sewers, and communal fountains made epidemics a regular part of life. The infamous plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War wiped out 1/3 of the city. Thucydides wrote about it, then he got it, then somehow survived. Most weren't so lucky. War was constant. If you were a man, odds were you'd die holding a spear or rowing a trireme. Even if you weren't killed in battle, injuries often turned fatal days later due to no antibiotics, no stitches, just hope and garlic compresses. And there was always the possibility of death by divine tantrum. Displease a god. Forget a sacrifice. Mock a temple statue or speak ill of Zeus. After 3 cups of wine, and you could find yourself on the wrong end of a lightning bolt, plague, or spontaneous goat stampede. Burial rites were important. If your family couldn't afford a proper funeral with coins for the ferrymen and rituals to secure your spot in the afterlife, you might be dumped outside the city walls, unmarked and forgotten. Not only was that tragic, it was spiritually dangerous. The Greeks believed unburied souls wandered eternally, caught between worlds. Death wasn't poetic, it was daily, and it didn't care about your philosophy, your beauty, or your lineage. You could be a slave, a general, or a poet, and still die from a moldy fig or an angry mosquito. The Greeks had 12 Olympians, and not a single one of them liked you. In theory, ancient Greek religion was all about harmony, with the divine worshipping Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and the rest of the Golden Crew up on Mount Olympus. In practice, it was constant spiritual damage control. These gods weren't peaceful, all-loving deities. They were divine drama queens with superpowers. Forget a sacrifice. They'd ruin your crops. Say the wrong prayer, your ship sinks. Step into the wrong grove, snake bite, plague, famine, take your pick. The gods didn't just demand your loyalty, they demanded perfect timing, flawless rituals, and unblinking obedience. You didn't have weekly temple visits. You had daily rituals, home altars, seasonal festivals, and civic ceremonies. Before planting crops, pray to Demeter. Going to war, offer to Ares. Traveling by sea, you'd better pour out some wine to Poseidon, and maybe throw in a goat, just to be safe. Each god had favorites and grudges. Apollo might protect your city, unless your grandfather offended him once, in which case you're cursed until further notice. Hera was the goddess of marriage, but she also specialized in making mortal women's lives miserable if Zeus so much as looked at them. Athena rewarded wisdom and also turned people into spiders, casual. And if the Olympians weren't enough to keep you nervous, there were nymphs, satyrs, spirits, river gods, and monsters lurking around every corner. Step on the wrong patch of sacred land, and suddenly your left leg belongs to a vengeful woodland sprite. But worst of all, you never knew why something bad happened. Was it the wrong offering? The wrong timing? Did you insult a god in a dream? Maybe it was your cousin? Maybe it was something your great-grandfather did. Doesn't matter. The gods work in mysterious and deeply personal ways. And yet, for all the terror, Greek religion was woven into every part of life, from politics to childbirth to the Olympic Games. You feared the gods, yes, but you also depended on them. Their temples were city landmarks, their festivals were national holidays, and their myths explained everything from lightning to love. You didn't believe in gods out of faith. You believed out of survival instinct. So, after everything, the heat, the labor, the gods, the philosophers, and the constant threat of exile or death, what did an ancient Greek actually do for fun? Turns out, quite a bit, assuming you had the time, money, or stamina to enjoy it. Let's start with the Olympic Games, not the modern torch relay version, but the original, held every 4 years in Olympia to honor Zeus. It was less about sports and more about religion, politics, and not dying in a chariot race. Athletes competed naked, covered in olive oil, in events like running, wrestling, boxing, and the pancration, a rules fight where anything short of killing was fair game. Spectators came from all over Greece, and winning wasn't just glory. It was a divine endorsement. If you won, your city might build you a statue, or at least not ostracize you for a while. Beyond the Olympics, festivals were the backbone of Greek fun. The Dionysia wasn't just theater. It was a week-long party with wine, sacrifices, and processions that made modern carnivals look tame. You'd drink, dance, and maybe accidentally offend a god, but it was worth it. Smaller festivals happened year-round, honoring everyone from Apollo to local nymphs, with music, feasting, and the occasional goat sacrifice. If you were a man with money, the symposium was your go-to. Think dinner party, but with more wine, hired entertainers, and philosophical debates that ended in someone crying or passing out. Women, unless they were courtesans, weren't invited, so they had their own gatherings, often weaving or storytelling at home. For the less wealthy, fun was simpler, playing knucklebones, a dice game with sheep bones, or betting on cockfights in the street. Kids played with clay toys, hoops, or just chased each other through the agora until someone tripped over a philosopher. Music was everywhere, lyres, flutes, and drums at festivals, weddings, or just to annoy your neighbor. Even the poorest citizen could enjoy a good story, retelling myths about heroes like Achilles or Odysseus around a fire. But fun wasn't free of risk. Too much wine, and you might insult a god or wake up with a new enemy. Too much dancing, and your khitan could betray you in front of the entire village. Ancient Greek leisure was a balance of joy, community, and the ever-present chance of divine or social disaster. So yeah, ancient Greece was a tough place to live, but they knew how to throw a party. Let's talk trade, because while philosophers were debating truth and athletes were wrestling naked, someone had to keep the olive oil flowing. Ancient Greece wasn't a single economy. It was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own specialties. Athens had silver and pottery. Corinth had bronze. Rhodes had wine. And everybody wanted everybody else's stuff. Most trade happened by sea because roads were terrible, and donkeys weren't exactly FedEx. Ships carried grain from Egypt, timber from Macedonia, and luxury goods like purple dye from Phoenicia. Piracy was a constant problem. Your cargo could end up in the hands of some bearded guy with a fast boat and no morals. If you were a merchant, you haggled in the agora, weighed goods with stones, and prayed your scales weren't rigged. Coinage was new, invented in Lydia but adopted by Greeks, so bartering was still common. A farmer might trade a sack of barley for a jug of wine, then both get robbed on the way home. Markets were loud, chaotic, and smelled like fish, sweat, and ambition. If you were successful, you could afford a better chiton, or maybe a slave to carry your goods. If you failed, you went home with a sack of regret and a story about a shady Spartan. Trade kept Greece connected, but it also fueled rivalries, wars, and the occasional diplomatic tantrum. No wonder they needed all that philosophy to cope. Education in ancient Greece wasn't what you think. There were no standardized schools, no diplomas, and definitely no student loans. If you were a boy from a decent family in Athens, you might get a private tutor or attend a small school run by a philosopher or a rhetorician. You learned reading, writing, math, music, and poetry, plus a lot of Homer, because the Iliad was basically the Greek Bible. Physical training was just as important. You wrestled, ran, and practiced throwing spears to prepare for war. Girls, unless they were Spartan, got little to no formal education. They learned domestic skills from their mothers, weaving, cooking, and how to manage a household without losing their minds. In Sparta, girls were educated to be strong, literate, and ready to raise warriors, which meant running, dancing, and learning to throw shade at Athenian women. Higher education, if you could call it that, meant sitting at the feet of someone like Plato or Aristotle, arguing about the nature of reality. It wasn't about a degree, it was about sharpening your mind to survive politics, war, or a conversation with Socrates. Most people, though, learned a trade, farming, pottery, or blacksmithing, passed down from father to son. Education was practical, brutal, and deeply unequal, but it produced thinkers who changed the world. Ancient Greek cities weren't just places to live, they were statements, each shouting its own identity through architecture, art, and attitude. Athens was all about grandeur. The Parthenon, marble statues, and an agora that never slept. Sparta was a military camp with buildings that screamed, "We don't care about aesthetics, we care about headlocks." Corinth was a trade hub, flashy with bronze and temples to Aphrodite, who probably approved of the nightlife. Thebes had a mythic vibe, with walls built by gods and a history of defying everyone. Cities were built around an acropolis, a fortified hill with temples, because gods and defense came first. Houses were packed close, streets were narrow, and sanitation was a suggestion, not a rule. Public spaces like the agora or a theater were where the city's soul lived, loud and chaotic. Walls were a big deal. A city without strong walls was basically begging to be invaded. Athens' long walls connected the city to its port, ensuring they could eat during a siege. Every city had its own patron god, festivals, and way of telling everyone else they were doing it wrong. City pride fueled rivalries, alliances, and wars that shaped Greek history. Living in a Greek city meant you were part of something bigger, but also a target for everyone else's ambition. The Greek countryside wasn't a peaceful retreat. It was where most people lived, worked, and prayed not to starve. Farmers grew barley, olives, grapes, and figs, but the soil was rocky and rain was a gamble. You plowed with oxen if you were lucky, by hand if you weren't, and every harvest was a race against drought or locusts. Rural life meant isolation. News came from travelers, and your nearest neighbor might be a day's walk away. Bandits were a problem, so you kept a spear handy and hoped your dog was loud. Temples dotted the landscape, small altars to local gods or nymphs, because divine protection was non-negotiable. Festivals brought villages together, with music, dance, and enough wine to forget the harvest worries. Rural Greeks were tough, self-reliant, and deeply tied to the land, but one bad season could ruin everything. Ancient Greek ships weren't just transportation. They were the lifeblood of trade, war, and survival. Triremes, with 3 rows of oars, were fast, deadly, and packed with rowers who smelled worse than the fish they sailed past. Ramming was the main tactic. You aimed for the enemy's hull and hoped your own ship didn't splinter. Merchant ships were slower, broader, and carried everything from grain to amphorae of wine. Navigation relied on stars, landmarks, and prayers to Poseidon, because compasses were 500 years away. Storms could sink you, pirates could rob you, and a bad captain could beat you on a rock. Still, the sea connected Greece to Egypt, Persia, and beyond, making it a cultural crossroads. If you were a sailor, you lived hard, loved briefly, and hoped to retire before Poseidon noticed you. Greek art wasn't just decoration. It was storytelling, propaganda, and a flex of skill. Pottery was huge, painted with myths, battles, or daily life, and every household had a few. Black figure and red figure style showed gods, heroes, or your drunk uncle at a symposium. Sculptures were lifelike, from marble kuroi to colossal bronze gods, meant to inspire awe. Temples were art themselves, with friezes and columns that screamed, "We're better than you." Art was public. Even the poorest citizen could see a statue or a painted pot in the agora. It wasn't about beauty alone. It was about reminding you who you were and who was in charge. Warfare in ancient Greece wasn't just a job. It was a lifestyle, and every citizen was a soldier in waiting. Battles were brutal, face-to-face, with hoplites in tight phalanx formations, shields locked, spears thrusting. Victory meant glory. Defeat meant slavery or death. Zegas were common, starving cities into submission or breaching walls with rams. Naval battles, like Salamis, turned the tide of wars, with triremes ramming at full speed. War wasn't glorious. It was sweaty, bloody, and left widows and orphans in every city. Yet it defined Greek identity, from the Trojan War myths to the Persian invasions. Peace was rare, and every man knew his next fight was just a vote away. Diplomacy in ancient Greece was less about handshakes and more about veiled threats and fragile alliances. City-states formed leagues, like the Delian or Peloponnesian, but trust was as rare as a sober symposium. Ambassadors carried olive branches, but spoke with the weight of armies behind them. Treaties were sworn before gods but broken as soon as someone smelled weakness. The oracle at Delphi was a diplomatic hotline, but her cryptic answers often started wars instead of stopping them. Diplomacy kept Greece from constant war, but only just. Myths were the Greeks' way of explaining the world, from why the sun rises to why your life is a mess. Stories of gods, heroes, and monsters were told at festivals, etched on pottery, and sung by poets. The Trojan War wasn't just a story. It was a cultural touchstone, teaching honor, betrayal, and the cost of pride. Myths justified everything: city pride, religious rituals, even why women shouldn't vote. They weren't fairy tales. They were the lens through which Greeks saw reality. Timekeeping in ancient Greece was less about clocks and more about the sun, stars, and festivals. Sundials tracked hours, but only on clear days, and water clocks were used for speeches or trials. Days started at sunrise, and festivals marked the calendar like the Panathenea for Athena. Months were lunar, named after gods or harvests, and varied by city, so good luck scheduling across Greece. Time wasn't precise. It was felt, measured by seasons, sacrifices, and the gods' whims. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was sacred, woven into rituals, theater, and war. Lyres and flutes accompanied hymns to gods, while drums set the pace for trireme rowers. Poets like Sappho turned music into poetry, singing of love and longing. Music could soothe, inspire, or signal the start of a battle. Every Greek knew a tune, even if it was just a hymn to Apollo hummed while fetching water. Greek food wasn't gourmet, it was survival, with occasional bursts of flavor if you were lucky. Barley bread, olives, figs, and watered wine were staples. Meat was rare, saved for festivals or sacrifices. Fish was common near the coast, but preservation meant salt and a lot of patience. Spices were basic. Garlic, thyme, maybe coriander if you knew a good trader. Dining was communal, but men and women often ate separately, reinforcing social divides. A good meal was a luxury. A bad one was just Tuesday. Travel in ancient Greece was slow, dangerous, and usually not worth the hassle. You walked or rode a donkey. Carts were rare, and roads were more like suggestions. By sea, you faced storms, pirates, and captains who couldn't read the stars. Inns were basic, often just a mat and a bowl of questionable stew. Travel was for trade, pilgrimage, or war, not for fun. If you made it home, you thanked every god you could name. Family was the core of Greek life, but it wasn't all warm hugs and shared olives. Fathers ruled, mothers managed, and children were investments for the future or burdens if they were girls. Marriages were arranged, often for alliances or dowries, not love. Extended families lived close, sharing resources and grudges. Loyalty to family was absolute, but so was the pressure to uphold honor. A family's reputation could make or break your life in a Greek city. Justice in ancient Greece wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a public spectacle with high stakes. In Athens, juries of hundreds decided cases from theft to murder, based on speeches, not evidence. No lawyers. You defended yourself, so you'd better be persuasive or rich enough to hire a speechwriter. Punishments ranged from fines to exile to drinking hemlock, like Socrates did. Blood feuds were common outside Athens, where family honor trumped law. Justice was less about fairness and more about who told the better story. Greek festivals weren't just parties. They were sacred, political, and sometimes athletic blowouts. The Panathenea in Athens included processions, sacrifices, and a race in full armor. Because why not? Smaller festivals honored local gods, with music, dance, and enough wine to blur the line between devotion and debauchery. Everyone participated, from slaves to citizens, though roles varied by status. Festivals reinforced community, faith, and the ever-present need to appease the gods. Clothing in ancient Greece was simple but carried social weight. A fine chiton signaled wealth. A patched one screamed poverty. Colors like purple were for the elite. Most wore plain white or brown. Accessories like brooches or belts showed status, but also held your outfit together. Clothing wasn't just fashion. It was a public statement of who you were. Greek homes were basic, built for function, not comfort. Wealthy homes had courtyards and mosaics. Poor ones were one-room shacks. Furniture was minimal. Mats, low tables, and maybe a wooden chest. Privacy was a myth. Families shared space with goats and grudges. Your home was your shelter, your workplace, and your social hub all in one. Money in ancient Greece was new and not universal. Coins were silver or bronze, stamped with city symbols, like Athens' owl. Bartering was still king in rural areas, trading goods for survival. Wealth was measured in land, slaves, or reputation, not just coins. Debt could mean slavery if you couldn't pay, a constant threat. Money changed Greece, but survival was still about connections and cunning. Friendship in ancient Greece was serious business, often more binding than family. Friends fought together, shared resources, and backed each other in politics. Betrayal was a scandal worse than losing a battle. Philosophers like Aristotle wrote about friendship as a virtue, not just a bond. A true friend was your shield in a world of wars and ostracism. Love in ancient Greece was complicated, often more about duty than passion. Romantic love existed in poetry, like Sappho's, but marriages were practical. Men could have lovers, but women faced harsh judgment for the same. Love between men, especially in mentorships, was accepted, even idealized. Love was a luxury, overshadowed by survival and social rules. Death rituals were elaborate, ensuring the soul's journey to the underworld. Bodies were washed, wrapped, and mourned with loud wailing to honor the dead. Offerings of food and wine were buried to appease the gods and ferrymen. Neglecting rites could doom the soul to wander, a fate worse than death. Death was a community event, binding the living to the dead. Greek science was less about labs and more about observing the world and arguing. Thinkers like Thales predicted eclipses, while Pythagoras obsessed over numbers. Medicine was trial and error, but Hippocrates laid the groundwork for observation-based healing. Science was philosophy's sibling, driven by questions, not tools. It wasn't precise, but it sparked ideas that shaped the modern world. Greek literature was epic, tragic, and sometimes hilariously rude. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were cultural Bibles, recited at every gathering. Tragedies by Sophocles and Euripides explored fate, hubris, and human flaws. Comedies by Aristophanes mocked everyone from gods to politicians. Literature was oral, performed, and deeply tied to identity. Greek architecture was about harmony, power, and divine approval. Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns weren't just supports, they were art. Temples, theaters, and stoves were built to last, and many still stand. Every building told a story of the city's wealth and gods. Architecture wasn't just shelter, it was a legacy. Greek sports weren't just games, they were tests of strength, honor, and divine favor. The Olympics were the pinnacle, but local games happened everywhere. Winning meant statues, poems, and bragging rights for your city. Losing meant shame, unless you died trying, which was oddly honorable. Sports were war without blood, uniting Greeks in competition. Greek law varied by city, but it was always about order, not justice. Athens had written codes, but juries decided based on persuasion. Sparta relied on unwritten customs, enforced by fear and honor. Punishments were harsh: death, exile, or public shaming. Law was a tool to keep the city together, not to protect the weak. Greek trade routes stretched from Egypt to the Black Sea, connecting cultures. Merchants faced storms, pirates, and shady middlemen. Goods like wine, oil, and pottery defined Greek identity abroad. Trade brought wealth, but also wars over ports and routes. Every amphora carried a piece of Greece to the world. Greek religion shaped daily life, from sacrifices to oracles. Every action, from planting to sailing, required divine approval. Oracles like Delphi guided cities, often with disastrous results. Religion wasn't faith, it was a contract with unpredictable gods. It gave Greeks meaning but also constant anxiety. Greek politics were messy, loud, and often deadly. Democracy in Athens was revolutionary, but limited to elite men. Oligarchies, tyrannies, and monarchies ruled elsewhere, each with its own drama. Political rivalries fueled wars, betrayals, and ostracism. Politics was life. Every citizen was a player, like it or not. Greek warfare defined their world, from hoplites to triremes. Every man was a soldier, every city a potential battlefield. Glory was the goal, but survival was the reality. Wars shaped myths, politics, and the Greek psyche. Peace was a dream, rarely a reality. Greek philosophy wasn't just thought, it was a way of life. It questioned everything, gods, politics, even existence itself. Philosophers were heroes, annoyances, and sometimes martyrs. Their ideas outlived them, shaping the modern world. Philosophy was Greece's greatest export after olive oil. Ancient Greece was a paradox, brilliant and brutal, free and oppressive. It gave us democracy, philosophy, and art, but also slavery, war, and exclusion. Life was hard, short, and often unfair, but Greeks faced it with grit and genius. Their legacy is in our laws, our art, our questions about the world. So next time you vote, read Plato or eat an olive, thank the Greeks, but maybe don't wish you lived there. And that's ancient Greece, a civilization that changed the world, one sweaty, philosophical, olive-oiled day at a time. After a long day in ancient Greece, you didn't just collapse, you had to secure your home, because doors were flimsy and bandits didn't send RSVPs. Your lock was a rope or a basic latch, so you slept with one eye open and a dagger under your mat. Sleep wasn't guaranteed. Roosters crowed, goats bleated, and your neighbor's late-night symposium could wake the dead. Dreams were serious business, often seen as messages from the gods or warnings about that olive you shouldn't have eaten. If you were rich, you might consult a dream interpreter. If not, you just prayed it wasn't Zeus being petty again. Morning meant restarting the fire, a tedious task using flint, tinder, and a lot of cursing. No matches, no lighters, just you, a rock, and the hope your kindling wasn't damp from last night's rain. Cooking was a family affair, done over an open hearth with clay pots that cracked if you looked at them wrong. Your menu was barley porridge or lentil stew, spiced with whatever herbs you could scavenge from the hillside. If you burned the stew, tough luck. You ate it anyway, because wasting food was a sin and a tragedy. Water wasn't just for drinking. It was for washing clothes, which meant a trip to the river and a fight with stubborn stains. No soap, just ash and elbow grease, and your chiton still smelled like yesterday's goat stew. Social visits were a big deal. You didn't just pop by, you brought a gift, like figs or a jug of wine. Gossip was the main entertainment, swapping stories about who offended Athena or whose cow ran away. If you were a man, you might linger in the agora, debating politics or dodging philosophers with too many questions. Women's social circles were tighter, often limited to family or neighbors, but the tea was just as spicy. Inviting someone over meant sharing your best wine, even if it tasted like pine resin and regret. Guest friendship, or xenia, was sacred. A bad host could expect a divine lightning bolt, or at least a bad reputation. Technology in ancient Greece was clever but basic, like the potter's wheel, which turned mud into art. They had cranes for lifting temple stones, powered by human sweat, and prayers for no rope snaps. Water mills existed but were rare. Most grinding was done by hand, usually by women or slaves. Ziga weapons like catapults were cutting edge, but accuracy was more hope than science. No paper, so they wrote on papyrus, wax tablets, or pottery shards, which doubled as voting ballots. Lamps were clay, fueled by olive oil, and gave just enough light to trip over your own sandals. Greek engineering shone in aqueducts, channeling water to cities, but leaks were a fact of life. Farmers used iron-tipped plows, but they still broke on rocky soil, leaving you to curse Demeter. Medicine had tools like bronze scalpels, but no anesthesia meant you felt every cut. Greek baths were a luxury, with heated floors for the rich, but most just used a cold splash. Time off wasn't a concept. Even festivals meant work, like preparing offerings or dodging drunk alms. Leisure was for the wealthy who reclined at symposia while slaves refilled their wine cups. Poor Greeks found joy in small things, like a good harvest or a neighbor's funny story. Pets weren't cuddly companions. Dogs guarded homes, and cats were for catching mice. Superstitions ruled. A black cat, a bad omen, a sneeze, a sign from the gods. Amulets were worn to ward off the evil eye, because envy could curse your whole family. Weddings were loud, with processions, torches, and songs to scare off bad spirits. The bride's veil wasn't for beauty. It hid her from evil forces until the vows were done. Divorce was rare but possible, though women needed a male relative to argue their case. Children were named on the 10th day, a ritual to ensure they were worth keeping. Toys were simple: clay dolls, wooden horses, or just a stick and a lot of imagination. School wasn't mandatory, so many kids worked fields or learned trades by age 10. Tattoos weren't for art. They marked slaves or prisoners, a permanent badge of shame. Beards were a man's pride, shaved only in mourning or as a political statement. Haircuts were done with bronze shears, often by a friend who wasn't great at it. Public baths were social hubs, where you scrubbed, gossiped, and hoped no one stole your sandals. Perfume was a status symbol, made from myrrh or roses, but it didn't hide the sweat. Letters were rare. If you sent one, it was on papyrus, carried by a trusted friend. News traveled by word of mouth, often distorted by the time it reached your village. Graffiti was common, scratched on walls to praise a lover or curse a rival. Markets had unofficial police, watching for thieves or rigged scales, but bribes were part of the game. At the end of the day, ancient Greeks lit their lamps, thanked their gods, and hoped tomorrow wasn't worse. In ancient Greece, craftsmen weren't just workers. They were artists, turning clay and bronze into stories that outlasted empires. Potters spun wheels by hand, shaping amphorae for wine or oil, praying the kiln didn't crack their week's work. Blacksmiths hammered bronze for shields and plows, their forges glowing like mini Hephaestus workshops. If your hammer slipped, you ruined a month's income and probably cursed every god you knew. Weavers, mostly women, spent hours at looms, creating chitons that kept Greece clothed and slightly less naked. A drop spindle could unravel a day's work, leaving you to mutter about Athena's unfair standards. Entertainment wasn't just festivals. Street performers juggled, sang, or told bawdy jokes for a handful of olives. If the crowd didn't laugh, you went home hungry because ancient Greece didn't believe in participation trophies. Board games like Patia, a strategy game with pebbles, kept Greeks scheming when they weren't at war. Losers often accused winners of cheating, sparking arguments that rivaled philosophical debates. Social hierarchies were rigid. A citizen could mock a slave but bowed to an aristocrat with better sandals. Even among citizens, wealth and lineage decided who got the best seat at the theater. Medics, foreign residents, paid taxes but couldn't vote, stuck in a limbo of respect and resentment. Slaves dreamed of freedom, but even freedmen were never equals, forever marked by their past. Women navigated hierarchies too, with priestesses holding rare power, but only if they served the right god. The environment shaped Greek life. Rocky hills meant tough farming, but olive trees thrived where grain failed. Droughts were common, turning fields to dust and farmers to desperate worshippers of Zeus for rain. Forests were sacred, home to nymphs, but also chopped for ships, angering spirits and gods alike. Earthquakes shook cities, seen as Poseidon's temper tantrums, prompting quick sacrifices to calm him. The sea was both lifeline and threat, giving fish and trade but swallowing ships in storms. Markets weren't just for trade. They were gossip hubs, where rumors spread faster than a trireme's oars. A bad rumor could ruin your reputation, so you kept your enemies close and your olives closer. Public speaking was an art. A good orator could sway a jury or calm an angry mob. A bad speech meant exile or worse, so you practiced until your voice echoed off the Acropolis. Children's games mimicked adult life. Boys played soldier, girls played house, both dreaming of glory. Discipline was harsh. A misbehaving kid faced a sandal or a switch. No timeouts here. Apprenticeships started young. A boy might learn pottery or masonry by sweeping the shop first. Girls learned from mothers, mastering looms and hearths to become invisible pillars of the home. Greek humor was sharp, from Aristophanes' plays to agora insults that cut deeper than a spear. If you couldn't take a joke, you stayed home, because Greeks didn't spare feelings. Medicine wasn't just herbs. Greeks used music and sleep therapy in Asclepius temples. A snake might slither over you during treatment, seen as a divine healer, not a health code violation. Barbers weren't just for haircuts. They doubled as surgeons, pulling teeth or stitching wounds. No anesthesia meant you gripped a stick and hoped the barber's hand was steady. Greek weddings included a ritual bath for the bride, purifying her for the gods and the groom's family. The groom's family inspected the dowry because love was nice, but land and amphorae were better. Funerals were loud. Professional mourners wailed to ensure the dead felt properly missed. A quiet funeral was shameful, like telling the underworld your family didn't care. Greek astronomy was practical. Sailors used stars to navigate, not just to ponder the cosmos. Eclipses were omens, sparking panic and sacrifices to appease angry gods. Greek baths were communal, but you brought your own strigil or risked borrowing a rusty one. Slaves fanned bathers, making luxury possible but reminding everyone of the cost. Greek roads were dusty tracks, turning to mud in rain, stranding travelers and their donkeys. Milestones marked distances, but they didn't help when your sandal broke halfway to Delphi. Greek festivals included contests, like poetry slams or who could sacrifice the fattest goat. Winning a contest meant fame. Losing meant you practiced for next year's rematch. Greek markets had unofficial poets, reciting for coins or a free fig from a merchant. If the poem flopped, you dodged thrown olives and reconsidered your career. At night, Greeks gathered by hearths, sharing stories, because firelight made even bad days feel epic. Ancient Greece was a grind, but every struggle, joke, and prayer built a world we still echo today.